Australia's getting richer, older, and surprisingly lonelier. And when you dig below the surface, it's clear these trends aren't random. We're reshaping our economy, our housing markets, our workforce, and even our social fabric in many ways people haven't even recognised. So welcome to this week's Demographics Decoded podcast, the show where we unveil the trends shaping your future. Hi, I'm Michael Yardney, and each week's leading demographer, Simon Kirstenmacher, and I try and dig beneath the data to uncover trends that are going to help you if you're a business person, an entrepreneur, an investor, and what this means for you. Our aim is to actually help make some sense of what's coming next so you can make smarter decisions. And today, Simon, I'd like to unpack some fresh data from the Hilda report, one of Australia's longest running studies tracking how real households are living, working, earning, spending and socialising, Simon.
It's an absolutely marvelous data set because not only does it show the status quo, but it does show 20 years into the past. So we can do longitudinal research about how life in Australia shifted from this household income and labor dynamic perspective. That's what HILDA stands for. Household income labor dynamics in Australia, I think. And it is a wonderful insight into the human expression of economic data.
Well, let's just make it clear. What's a longitudinal study?
Longitudinal data means we did run the exact same research, not just today, but we ran it 3 years, 7 years, 10 years in the past. And so we can then compare our consumer behavior in the here and now with how we used to consume, how we used to live, how we used to work, how we used to socialize 20 years ago. And so we see that there are certain kind of shifts in Australia, that life in Australia well and truly changed. And that's always important to remember, that we are not simply going from, this is not a bad thing. Life changes. And so if you are aging and you look back and you say, well, life used to be different. It's like, of course it was. And it always was changing. And you must not get stuck on your idea of what life looks like based on, well, let's say what it looked like in your 20s or 30s, because it is a different world, for better or worse, that you're living in now. And we can show how this world changed in data sets like this. So it's heaps of fun for a demographer to dive into this data set.
It's looking backwards at how things have changed, but I think it's also giving a hint for business people, entrepreneurs, investors as how we're going to move forward. And that's going to be critical for them to be successful.
Exactly. And that's the part. When you look back, you understand that certain kind of shifts come about because you push a big chunk or a small chunk of a population into a certain stage of the life cycle. And then we know how people behave in that life cycle a bit more. And then we can draw conclusions where we say, well, baby boomers behaved like this in their peak working age years. And so what will Gen X now look like since they are now moving through this peak working age years? And then we can also fantasize about what might millennials do when they in 10 years time reach peak working age years in the mid 50s. So there's certain kind of lessons that we can take, and we'll unpack those today.
Well, I guess that's the key. Australians often think the country's changing rapidly, but when you look back over 2 decades of data, sometimes you realise the shift was gradual, predictable, and actually in many cases inevitable. So that's where it's going to be useful looking forward.
Absolutely. And you see certain trends, like we look at stuff like loneliness. These are things that do not suddenly appear as a mass phenomenon. They sneak up on you. Every now and then there might be a rapid trend, like when you introduce AI on September 22. Something like this is all of a sudden that there it is. Then there's a rapid trend in some way or form. But most demographic trends sneak up on you. And the good thing is, because they sneak up on you, just the small developments that we see, we can kind of project them forward. And then when you carefully look, they don't actually sneak up on you. You can predict them.
Well, let's start with money, because that always gets everyone's attention. The Hilda report showed Australians are earning more, but they're feeling poorer, Simon.
Exactly. And that is well and truly the crux of why people view the world differently. It is, you do not live in $2001 or whatever your economic measurement is. You live in 2023 prices. You have these housing and affordability pressures. The last data set is 2023. So you have those up-to-date cost of living pressures. And money is nice. It sounds really awesome that you earn more money. But what didn't happen in the last 20 years is that housing costs stayed in relative terms the same. They became more expensive. Also, our income tax brackets are pretty much frozen. So that means that, yes, you moved up the income ladder, but because these tax brackets aren't indexed to inflation, all of a sudden you don't feel as rich as you would have expected you feel once you reach the top income bracket of $180,000. You feel like I should be richer now, but you are not, because back in the day, $180,000, even if it's inflation adjusted, um, and so forth, it felt like more, it was more. And so now that's not it. And so we always need to look at housing, insurance, childcare as the biggest drivers of costs that really escalated. And so we of course also judge prosperity relative to certain kind of benchmarks. And one of the benchmarks are our parents. And so if we as young people say, at 30, my parents managed to own a house and have 2 kids, and I'm living still in that house at 30. That's not a good comparison. So you don't feel that. And of course, you have certain things like the shift from cheap exports and falling interest rates to today's inflationary environment and so forth. They all feel like you get this whiplash, psychological whiplash, and you feel the problem is that you feel like you are the small man and everything works against you.
Well, how much of this is actually psychological then, Simon? How much of it is the news media, the cycle of pessimism, recency bias versus the genuine cost of living? If you're saying that, we're feeling that we're
Yeah.
the small man in all this.
Yeah, it is both. Yeah. So the recency bias that well and truly makes you feel that the rapid inflation, it feels worse than it probably actually is. But that's also because we obsess about this in the news cycle. So you constantly hear about it, and then it does really make you feel worse. But so you have stuff like the consumer price index. And if they show that things are actually going up much more than your wage, we talk about the essentials, we said it, housing, education, childcare. So there is real data behind it. But part of this is also just as psychology, is how we feel about it. And then we don't vote, by the way, we don't vote on reality, we vote on feeling, on perceived reality, just as a bit of a political sideline.
Sure. So I guess there's also been a rise in essential costs, the Hilda report showed. Childcare, rent, insurance, you mentioned that a moment ago. Rent and childcare saw the biggest proportional jumps.
Yes. And so when you see that rent and childcare is expensive, you see who is at biggest risk. So these are these young families that face the double bind. So you have a young family that pays expensive housing costs, that are paying high childcare costs, and the childcare costs then potentially limit the childcare participation, the workforce participation, because it's for certain kind of jobs, because childcare is so expensive. The moms, it's still the moms who do this thinking, they go, it's not worth it going back to work because it is so expensive to park you in childcare. And all of these income tests or the financial tests that we make are based on income. So if such a big share of your income goes into renting and childcare, you get hammered. We're not testing against your wealth for those tests, but your income. And so this is why families on relatively high income still feel absolutely screwed. You can argue, of course, how screwed are they really? How many reasons do they have to complain? But these are people that feel that things are working very much against them. Yeah, and the childcare is expensive because, well, there is an insane shortage of childcare workers, and we have more regulation, thank God. And it's a job that you can never, ever automate. And so then you have the idea that now everybody must put their kid into childcare because everyone is a dual income household for all intents and purposes. So you have no choice. And then you take the element of choice away from people. And that's when people get really, really angry because they feel my life decisions are being made by the state for me and I don't have a play in it. I don't have a say in it. And that's where aggression gets really big. Yeah. Another sideline, people feel about migration the same way because they argue things like, I've not been asked whether I want high migration, and now this is being forced on me. And that's the end of it. There's many, many things wrong with this argument in the first point, but the source for the aggression comes from the feeling that you've not been asked, that decisions have been made for you, and people don't like that one bit.
So how does this influence fertility decisions, workforce participation. Are people, because of these rising costs, changing what their family plans are, Simon?
Absolutely. It's very, very real. It doesn't so much change the question, do I want kids or not? But it very much impacts the questions, how many kids do I have? So we do see this in data. We have research on this. I, of course, am surrounded by young families in my stage of the life cycle. And it is a very, very common general argument that many working mothers say, I would have loved a third child, but it is financial absolutely not possible. And I think that's interesting that this is something that you now very, very openly talk about as an issue. I don't think this would have happened in the 80s. Just as a gut feeling, I, of course, wasn't around. Well, I was around in the 80s, but I was young. And so I would not have any kind of idea how important that was. But now it hits people. I live in the inner north in Melbourne. I'm surrounded by professional couples. These are not poor people. And so you then don't even want to know what's happening at the lower income households. These are very real decisions that people make simply based on money. And you can say, well, that's just the market at play. Thank God people act responsibly and they don't add more kids that they can't afford. Or you could say, again, decisions are being made for me, not by me. And that is what people really, really tend to, unlike,
You
dislike.
can understand that, yes. In the old days, the family unit used to have grandparents living in the same home. That happened in Europe, happened in Asia and other countries. And in fact, in my household, three generations lived and my grandparents looked
Yeah.
after me while my parents were at work.
Yeah, and that's so quite often I hear the argument: Are we now moving back to the intergenerational or the three generation in under one roof household? And I'd say, well, the market conditions would say that more families would consider that, but very few families would have a house that is large enough to pull this off. If I think about the relatively smaller houses that you live in and the increased demand that kids have their own bedroom, so you go, boy, what kind of house is that? Where you have a parental bedroom, two bedrooms for the kids, and a bedroom for grandma? That becomes a big house. And some people can pull it off. Well done. But I'm still not sure that this can be a mass solution. But again, households are, economically speaking, rather rational. And so if this is rationally logical for a family, they might just do this.
Interesting. So, Simon, we often talk about time poverty. We're talking at the moment now about the rise in the cost of living. Do spending patterns give us a clue about that?
Yes. So in a sense, we spend much more money based on things to save us time. So if you're short on time, you go, well, childcare. So I put my kid into childcare, can get more stuff done. Food delivery. I don't need to cook. Yes, it's more expensive, but hey, all of a sudden I freed up time in my day. If I can
Yes.
afford it, that's a good option. Cleaning. Cleaning is, of course, it is expensive to hire a cleaner these days, but hey, you save time. So it's in a sense, it's the YOLO, you only live once argument. Why would I not buy myself time if I can afford it? And I think this is ultimately a very, very logical and pragmatic way of spending your money. Is just that, is to throw money at things that can save you time. Again, this is a bit of a luxury argument because for many people, money is the big problem. But if you have a bit of spare money, might as well use it to buy yourself time. I think it's a very, very good way of doing this.
Now, Simon, as a demographer, you must love it when the census comes out, but also when the Hilda report comes out. How do you use this in your role as a demographer when you're assisting your clients?
Yeah, the Hilda report is a nice data set that allows us to understand how Australians live their life. So it's hard data, but it can beautifully be spun into a very fluent narrative of how we live our lives. And that's just from my job on stage, presenting on stage, sometimes present, or for portions of my presentations, present really hard data. But then you can't just entertain an audience for an hour with hard data. You must also show them a bit of the human side of life. But this is, of course, I need to spin this into narratives, but this can be done on hard data. Yeah, I'm just hiding the fact that it's hard data. It's like putting the vitamins into the dog food, something like this. Yeah, that's how I use Hilda on a daily basis.
I'll leave a link in the show notes to the demographics group where you're one of the directors. And if people are interested in having a chat with you about how you can help their business, their organization, their industry, I know that's what you specialize in. Similarly, at Metropole, we spend a lot of time looking at demographics. So even though our job is to help our clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic advice, demographics, in my mind, is going to be even more critical about how people want to live, where they want to live, whether they're owner occupiers or tenants, and that makes decisions on where we recommend to invest in property. So if you're keen to grow your own wealth, why not start by having a strategic plan put together for you? Have a chat with our team at Metropole. I'll leave a link in the show notes and take advantage of this property cycle as we're working our way through it. Now, I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you. And in fact, I think there's so much to discuss in this Hilda report, Simon. I think we're going to carry some over to next week's show as well. But what I'd like to talk about is the fact that Australians are working later in life. But before we get on to that, if you're new to this show and you haven't subscribed to this yet, wherever you're listening or watching this, subscribe. And if you're on a podcast player, click the automatic download so that you get each show each Wednesday when Simon and I bring this out. But Simon, as I read through the summary of the Hilda report, it was something that what didn't surprise me, that Australians are working later into life. Before, retirement was 60, 64. That used to be the norm. It's not anymore, is it?
No, no, and it's utterly unrealistic. So if you live longer and longer, you cannot you cannot work for 40 years and expect to be retired for another 30, 40 years on that income. That doesn't make sense in many circumstances. So that means we must further push out pension age, retirement age, and that will happen. That is an absolute, demographically speaking, that's an absolute no-brainer that we do this. So it's just demographics that suggest we must work longer in life. And there's also, thank God, a shift in the economy that allows this to be much easier, this transition, because we have a bigger chunk of us working in knowledge type jobs. And you can easily do our type of work well into your 60s and 70s. But laying bricks into your 70s, that becomes a bit more challenging. Yeah? But of course, statistically speaking, retirement age would still be pushed up quite easily by more people having knowledge jobs. We are longer. And of course, some people simply have to work longer because retirement is very, very expensive, particularly, of course, if you are not a homeowner. Because if you are renting, then the monthly money that you need to throw at housing, that is bigger. And so then you run out of money. And in that sense, we are facing a world where more Australians have to work longer. It is not a choice. We know that it's great for your mental health, for your brain health, to work longer as well. But that's probably not why many people in lower income jobs choose to work longer. It is cold-hearted financial necessity there. And of course, on top of this, we have the idea that we have quite a few people where such a big chunk of their identity is tied to their work persona. And so why would I give up my work persona if it worked for me? Particularly if I had a traditional career where I got a bit better, a bit more respected, a bit higher income year after year. Why would I want to give this up at 65? This is just getting fun. I'm not tasked with the technical tasks anymore. I'm probably doing much more strategic work, much more networking. That's easier. That's fun. I might as well work on longer. So all of these things combined just drive a humble, innocent, set like, retirement age further and further upwards.
Well, when I was young, I remember my first trip to America, and it was probably in the 70s. And in Australia, people retired at 60, 65. And there were people serving me in the restaurants. I remember turning up at a hotel and the gentleman taking the concierge taking the suitcases out of the taxi was probably in his 70s, and I felt embarrassed. I was in my 20s, and I thought, hey, no, you shouldn't be lifting these heavy suitcases. But that was the norm back then, because I guess they didn't have the financial support systems, and people in America had to work much longer. It's now ended up here in Australia as well.
Exactly, not at the rate yet as in the US. When you go to the US and you have people who bag your groceries in the 80s. It is a common sight to see this. None of those people do this for the love of the job. This is necessity. So I think the goal for us as a society always is, well, how can we create a system where as many people as humanly possible can retire in financial safety and security? Part of this is a systemic responsibility. Part of this is your personal responsibility of for your whole life long, keeping in mind that you will get old at some stage and then putting enough money aside. We have now a forced savings scheme with superannuation that should make this a bit easier for the system, which of course the US does not have. And so I think we put a couple of things in place that will serve us well as a nation. But is this enough to ensure that we don't have heaps of people in old age that will be that will be doing it tough? I think that there will be plenty of people who suffer financially in old age.
Well, we don't know how long the government is going to be able to keep the pension system up if there's more older people using healthcare, which is clearly expensive, and living costs, and living much longer, living into their 80s and 90s. It means we're going to need a lot more money in the system, and that's either going to be more tax-paying workers, and that's why immigration has to keep high, or they're going to have to tax those who are currently working more. Neither of them seems like a particularly good outcome.
No, and that's the reality of hard choices. So I'm quite peeved when people make simplistic arguments about just change one particular lever that you're currently obsessed about, and then everything will fall into place. That will not be the case. And I always point to people who say just cut migration and then everything is well. You solve a certain kind of issue potentially when you cut migration, but you then create other issues. We are now dealing with a complex interconnected system, and any change to one lever, to one measure, has unintended consequences across the whole system. So anyone who does not talk about complex systemic change doesn't know what they're talking about, to be honest. This is a complex system. It does need complex solutions. Simplistic things will not cut the mustard, so to speak.
Well, what about this longer work life? How's that going to affect younger generations? What does it mean for them?
Well, in a sense, more competition because you just need to work longer. You need to find sectors that you can work in longer. You better position yourself around jobs that provide you with enough income. It also means, of course, that potentially you benefit from it by more knowledge transfer. Meaning, if there are more older people in the workforce and you manage to find a way within your organization to download the knowledge of these senior staff members into the heads of the young people, you can potentially speed up something like strategical knowledge because there's a lot that you just acquire by learning by doing. And if you get more wisdom out of the oldies into the youngins, your company will be better off. So there's that. And you will see much more older colleagues across all industries as a young worker because you have more people in their 60s and 70s even. And so just think about what a hospital would look like. You'd have older doctors, but that's maybe a job where you're very comfortable with an older worker. But even stuff like education, management consulting, business, every sector really will have more older people. And so, well, as long as the skills shortage remains, these old people are not limiting job opportunities for young people. Yeah, so I don't think that's a major argument that the old people staying in the job ruin life for the young ones. I don't think that's right because we discussed it so often on this podcast. We continue to run out of workers in this country. And so suggesting that people work longer does the whole system really, really good.
Well, we've often talked about running out of workers, and particularly in certain industries. By the way, if you're interested in this, why not go back to some of the old episodes that Simon and I have covered where you can learn about that? But people are going to be listening to you, Simon, and saying, yes, but AI is going to take over. In fact, probably no one's going to have a job in the future and we're all going to have universal income. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't buy it, to be honest. I look at so many jobs that we have in Australia where in the short to medium term AI will have very little impact. If you look at something like aged care, for example, There is a bit of efficiencies that you could squeeze it out through AI by minimizing paperwork, for example, and then you free up man hours that can be spent on care duty. But these will be care jobs. If I'm looking at retail as a whole, think about where retail takes place in so many ways and forms. There must be retail assistants, is the ABS classification for these jobs. They will be around. Yes, AI, self checkouts, whatever, they might help to minimize these number of people. But we're still in a country that grows at 3.5 million people each decade. So these jobs must be around. And even if certain kind of jobs were to be taken by AI, I can still easily think of enough stuff that this country needs to be doing. We have 20 years worth of infrastructure backlog in this country. We need to build more housing. And then, of course, if the country continues to get richer in the process, people would then buy human services to go to a yoga retreat, to have lifting advice, to go to massages, whatever. All of those things would in one way or another require at least some sort of human labor. So the idea that we run out of stuff for humans to do, I find incredibly hard to believe.
Even if robots come in and do a lot of those jobs, I read somewhere how much Elon Musk is earning. Was it $1 trillion or something crazy with his idea of bringing robots in to replace workers?
Again, all the servicing of robots going to be done by robots and so forth. And then as a system, of course, if we were to suggest that human labor, the big element of the Hilda service is labor, that this goes away. Yeah, if this wealth was spread through universal income, that'd be fun. But why would it? So far, we're going back to our standard Marxist arguments, the division of labor and capital. These were two different groups, labor and capital. In the environment where labor is owned by capital, because it is digital, because it is robotic, why would capital hand the fruits of labor over to some human?
Fully agree. I understand that. Yes, yeah. So there's a lot of faults in this argument, very much so. So watch this space. But interestingly, just finishing off on this concept of Australians working longer, I know a lot of people watching us and listening to us are interested in property as property investors, or even just for how their own home is going to be valued. What does older people working later in life mean for our housing market, Simon?
Well, I guess everything happens a bit later in our life cycles these days. So that means that property cycles change. So first home buyership, I think the median first home buyer now is 38 in Australia, which would have been a decade younger, not too long ago. And so we go, okay, so that changes things. That means we delay things like home upgrades. That means that we delay things like renovations. That the downsizing boom that will take place longer because you can live independently for longer in your family home. So in a sense, we push the whole cycle a bit further out.
Well, Simon, there's so much more I want to discuss about the Hilda report that if it's okay with you, I'd like to continue on with this next week because as we've seen from the first bit of this discussion, Australia isn't standing still. We're wealthier than ever, but we're facing extra costs. We're working longer and many of us feel isolated. And the gap between homeowners and renters, especially in retirement, is widening, as we've said. But I think these statistics are important, whether you're in business or as an investor. So I'd really like to dig into it a little bit deeper. So let's catch up again and discuss the rest of this next week, please.
Let's do it. There's so much more to talk about. Loneliness, fertility, heaps of fun little things are hiding in Hilda.
Let's catch up then. Thanks, Simon.
See you then.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.